Hi, I'm Robert Tolpe, and today I'm talking about homeschooling in America, and not the good kind. If you taught your 11-year-old 3 foreign languages and calculus, this video is not about you. I chose this topic because I saw a TikTok of a homeschooled adult who didn't even know there was a civil rights movement until 2 years ago. It turns out that you can legally keep your kid out of school and not educate them at all in most of the United States. And that's kind of terrifying, so let's talk about that, shall we? I was inspired to make this video after I came across a TikToker named Anna Rose who grew up in a fundamentalist Christian household. As a kid, they were homeschooled by their parents who neglected to properly educate them. Anna is the TikToker who claims to not have known about the American Civil Rights Movement until 2 years ago. Their parents taught her misinformation about science and failed to teach her foundational skills. They were a part of the Quiverful movement, a fundamentalist Christian movement whose followers think they need to pop out as many Christian babies as possible to keep pace with the Islamic hordes. I'm not joking.
We've been raising for the last few generations about 1.8 member families. Islamics all around the world raise about 6.8 member families.
As an 11-year-old, Anna was responsible for educating their siblings. Their parents taught them that the Earth is only a few thousand years old, and that climate change and evolution are fake. Anna's parents only allowed them to read certain religiously inspired textbooks, and they had to dumpster dive at the local junior high school for proper educational resources, which of course they didn't understand because they didn't go to school. Unfortunately, Anna's experience is not unique. Fundamentalist parents often turn to religious educational resources to teach their children a version of science and history that reflects their faith. These religious educational resources are often beyond inadequate. They are misleading and wrong. I purchased a copy of the 3rd edition of Anna's childhood biology textbook, and it's bizarre. The diagrams look like they could be from any other textbook, but the words on the page are complete nonsense. There are passages asserting that concern about global climate change is vastly overblown, and that we can't count on the fossil record as evidence of evolution because the geologic column was clearly formed during the Great Flood and not over millions of years. The problem with these assertions is that they are unfounded. We already see the devastating effects of climate change right in front of our eyes. As for the geologic column, certain things that you'd expect to see if it was formed by a cataclysmic flood, such as dinosaur fossils from the Jurassic period swimming up into Cretaceous strata, are not present in the fossil record. Over and over again, the textbook presents evidence and conclusions that scientists have discovered, dismisses them, and then proceeds to make statements that are not supported by any evidence whatsoever. By not giving kids a foundational understanding of how to draw plausible conclusions from given evidence, you fail to teach them foundational reasoning skills critical to development. A proper education in history is also critical to developing reasoning skills. If your parents don't teach you about the civil rights movement, for instance, you're not going to be able to understand why people of color face so many challenges to this day. While not learning about the civil rights movement at all is perhaps on the extreme side of neglectful homeschooling, learning a doctored or oversimplified version of the civil rights movement could be just as harmful. Take the story of Rosa Parks, for example. A parent without a formal education in history would teach their kid that Rosa Parks was a tired old woman who didn't want to give up her seat on the bus. When she was arrested, that angered people, there were protests, and the buses were desegregated and discrimination was no more. The end. There's a lot of problems with that commonly told fable. Rosa Parks wasn't old. She was only 42 years of age when she refused to give up her seat on the bus. She wasn't just a random lady either, she was the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. Rosa Parks was a seasoned activist. Her refusal to give up her seat and the subsequent bus boycotts were carefully planned events. That's why they were so successful. All of this activism is completely erased when you tell kids the fairy tale about the old lady on the bus. Part of understanding the civil rights movement also involves touching upon what many people think is poison. Critical race theory, or CRT. CRT is the last thing that I would expect to be taught in a religious homeschool curriculum, but it's vital to have a general understanding of it. We think of activism as the primary cause of social change in the civil rights movement, and many times it was. But some scholars, most famously Derek Bell, believe that interest convergence, or the convergence of the best interests of elite whites and the best interests of black people, caused much of the social change we saw during the civil rights movement. A famous example of interest convergence is the case of Brown versus Board of Education. There's a lot of evidence that the ruling was no accident, and scholars like Bell have made convincing arguments that the desegregation of public schools was intended to achieve the goal of elevating America's status in global politics, and that once the goal was met, Brown versus Board of Ed was gutted by further court cases, and things became just as bad as they were before, but in a different way. Interest convergence doesn't explain everything, but it's very important to understand what it is and why activism doesn't always work. CRT and biology are difficult topics to teach to children, which is why education is best left to professionals and not untrained parents. It's also especially difficult to teach higher level topics to students who may have learning disabilities like dyslexia or autism. When parents isolate their kids from teachers trained to recognize these disabilities in children and keep them away from schools that provide special education services that can drastically improve a child's learning experience, they're potentially condemning their kid to unemployment and poverty later in life. This is not only the case for students with disabilities, it applies to all students. And it's saddening that these problems can be avoidable if parents would just send their kids to school. If education is so critical to childhood development and functioning well in society, why isn't school attendance mandatory? You'd think that in a developed country with free public education, not educating your kids would be considered neglect, but it isn't. In the majority of states, parents are not legally required to even have a high school degree or equivalent to teach their kids. And kids are not required to pass any kind of formal assessments to prove that their parents are meeting their minimum academic needs. Some states don't even require you to tell authorities that you plan on homeschooling your kid. You can just not send them to school without any proof that you're educating them yourself. This lack of any oversight in much of the country leaves room for parents to do unspeakable things to their kids without anyone noticing. If you don't want mandated reporters poking around in your family business, all you have to do is take your kids out of school. This is why homeschooling should be carefully regulated. Now, there are two arguments against regulating homeschooling. The first one, of course, is freedom! Specifically, freedom of religion, which is protected under the First Amendment. Freedom of religion is somewhat of a blank check in this country. Basically, as long as Jesus said you don't have to pay your taxes on your $10 million mansion and private jet, then the IRS's hands are tied. Now, I'm not saying the First Amendment isn't really important. I'm just saying freedom of religion shouldn't mean you could do whatever you damn well please if your religion tells you to do it, especially when you're doing something to someone else, in this case, a child. Certainly, a child's right not to be harmed and taught misinformation should outweigh their parents' vague religious right to harm and misinform them. I'm aware that religious freedom is not the only argument that people make in favor of homeschooling. Some parents believe it's a better experience for their child. This video focuses on the dark side of homeschooling, where parents neglect and misinform their kids. But it seems to me that most homeschooled kids turn out fine. Studies have not clearly shown that there are overwhelming achievement gaps between homeschooled and traditional students. This is why I don't think we should ban homeschooling altogether, as some countries have done. Germany, for instance, has a near complete ban on homeschooling with very few exceptions. I don't think that kind of law would work well in the US. The kinds of regulations that I'm proposing are ones that require parents to report their plans to homeschool to the state in which they reside. States should require that parents receive at least a GED or an undergraduate degree in order to homeschool their kids. Local schools or state programs should be in charge of overseeing homeschooled students. There should be inspections and background checks to make sure children aren't being put at risk by their parents. Academic records need to be kept to ensure students are following a structured curriculum and making progress. And finally, students should be evaluated annually using tests administered by qualified individuals. If the data show they are falling behind other students, the state should intervene and get these students professional help. There are many more policy ideas that should be put in place as well. Many of the policy ideas I just suggested are listed on the Coalition for Responsible Home Education's website linked below. They do good work, and I found their website very useful when making this video. In summary, I do think for some students that homeschooling can play a role in their academic career, and that there are countless parents who are more than qualified to teach their kids fundamental skills and knowledge that they can use later on in life. However, there are also many parents who are irresponsible and not qualified to teach their kids. Serious public attention should be given to students who slip through the cracks of our education system. We should not have grown adults who weren't taught about the civil rights movement or think that dinosaurs and humans coexisted only a few thousand years ago. That's not good. I hope that this video doesn't come across as arrogant or disrespectful at all, especially to anyone's religion. That was not the intention of this video. The vast majority of religious Americans have a commitment to taking care of and educating their kids. I'm solely speaking about neglectful parents who deny their kids access to proper education. Anyways, I'm Robert Tolpe, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and maybe even check out my Patreon if you'd like to support the channel, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Bye-bye!